Okay, welcome. Again, my name is Rodney Fong, and welcome to the Chamber of Commerce BuildSF webinar. BuildSF is an organization and a committee inside the Chamber of Commerce that has been around for quite a while, around everything related to construction, infrastructure, building in San Francisco, real estate in San Francisco, land use. And today we are very happy to have the Port of San Francisco presenting to us. Want to thank Kilroy and SOM for being sponsors of BuildSF. They have been integral partners and sponsors for the Chamber of Commerce and with the Chamber of Commerce and part of this great programming. So thank you to both of them. Want to just go over a little logistics. The Port of San Francisco is going to give about a 20-minute presentation. This is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel and other online channels in the future. And we find ourselves coming out of COVID, the city's bouncing back in resiliency and recovery. And day by day, you're starting to feel the change in the tune of San Francisco. So ever-changing city of San Francisco. Want to introduce our speaker, Brad Benson. Brad is the Director of Waterfront Resilience Program at the Port of San Francisco. Brad has been with the Port for 17 years now and has really overseen a lot of the 7.5 miles of waterfront in San Francisco. Many people are confused about what the Port is and where it stops and where it starts. But in essence, it's really at Hyde Street Pier, near Fisherman's Wharf, all the way around the Embarcadero, all the way down towards the Dog Patch area. So a large swath of property, real estate responsibility. And as we're learning more about sea level rise, climate change, sea level rise, that this has become a more important piece of San Francisco that we all need to pay attention to. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brad Benson.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Chamber members and staff, so much for having us today. We really appreciate the opportunity to share the work that the Port is doing, including work in the Waterfront Resilience Program. My presentation is going to be about 30 minutes or so. I just wanted to start by reflecting on the city trip that the Chamber organized to Seattle. This was back in 2019. It was an opportunity to, visit with members of city government in Seattle and learn about what they are doing with their Elliott Bay seawall and the rebuild of the whole waterfront, the replacement of the Alaskan Viaduct. And I just really am thankful that the Chamber organizes events like that are an opportunity for everybody to learn and for us to think about opportunities for our city. So with that, I'm going to jump into my presentation. Can you all see my presentation?
Yep. Thanks, Brad. Looks good.
Okay. So today I want to talk about the Port's Waterfront Resilience Program. It's an effort that Director Forbes established in 2019 to really understand earthquake and flood risk port-wide and begin robust planning to reduce that risk over time. So in terms of today's presentation, I'll provide background about the program, its purpose. We've completed some very robust risk assessment work, looking at the consequences of large earthquakes and flooding and sea level rise. We are developing an adaptation plan called the ADAPT plan that will map out actions potentially over the next 30 years to improve the resilience of the waterfront. And I'll talk a little bit about adaptation strategies that we're right in the process of developing right now. So just to give you a sense about the work that's going on in the program, this is the Port's jurisdiction that Rodney was talking about, shown in yellow here. We have some port-wide efforts, the ADAPT plan that I just mentioned. We're very lucky to have the Army Corps of Engineers as a partner in a flood resiliency study that is also port-wide. Today, I'll talk a little bit about our efforts to improve the Embarcadero seawall area. That was the focus of Proposition A, adopted by voters in 2018. We've been working with some city partners in other areas of the waterfront. We just completed Islas Creek Adaptation Strategy with the Planning Department, SFMTA, and the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So it's really a series of efforts to look at these risks port-wide. So digging into the Army Corps of Engineers flood study a little bit, the Army Corps are the nation's flood experts. They build most of the flood control projects around the country. The way you get started with the Corps is something called a New Start. We were lucky to get a coastal New Start, primarily because of our really strong congressional leadership in 2018. It's a 50-50 effort. The study period is between 2018 and 2025, and study is a bit of a misnomer for what is going on here. We are assessing flood risk, so that part is a study, but we're actually working with the Corps, with city department partners and the public to develop coastal flood protection projects that will minimize this risk. And if the Army Corps finds a federal interest in a project like that, and makes a recommendation to Congress, it opens the door to potentially billions of dollars in federal funding. Federal government will contribute up to 65% of the project cost and will actually build it. So it's one of our most important efforts in the Waterfront Resilience Program. I've already talked about this a bit. We're looking at seismic and flood risk in the resilience program. We really want you to think in this presentation that this is a multi-decade effort. It took 40 years to build the Embarcadero seawall and the historic piers that are connected to it. And the effort that we're talking about here is of a similar scale and time scale. We're going to have to develop a local, state, and federal funding sources to fund the program. Our priority is a focus on life safety and emergency response. The waterfront is going to play a key role in the aftermath of an earthquake. We're very much looking at adaptive management. We're going to, be addressing sea level rise risks over time, always engaging with the public, and really mindful of the historic and cultural resources that we steward along the waterfront. So we've been at it overall for almost a decade. We did our first sea level rise analysis in 2012. As I mentioned, voters adopted Proposition A, the $425 million seawall safety bond in 2018. The city actually published its first sea level rise vulnerability and consequences assessment looking at the whole city in 2020. And we're right now in this process of developing adaptation strategies that will be the basis of the draft ADAPT plan that we will roll out for public comments next year. So we've spent a lot of time documenting all the public and private assets and infrastructure along our shoreline in the future floodplain. We've conducted a multi-hazard risk assessment looking at consequences of earthquake and flood risk to our waterfront. We've begun to develop measures to address those risks. We're combining all of that information in developing the adaptation strategies that I'll talk about today, gearing up to provide program recommendations to the Port Commission at the end of this year. And that's really going to enable us to move, forward in terms of the first projects that will be funded by Proposition A. So now I want to share some of the risk assessment work that we've completed. First, I'll just mention about this waterfront. It's a human-made waterfront. Was built starting in the late 1800s through about 1930 with the intention of creating a deep water port. San Francisco was surrounded by flood mats, and they really went out to deep water. They dug a trench. They built a rock dike about 100 feet wide and 40 feet tall. It really was a marvel of engineering. Unfortunately, what they didn't understand at the time was that they were building on very weak soils. You'll see in the ferry building area on the map here that there's very deep Young Bay mud in that Yerba Buena Cove area. We also have sand conditions along the waterfront, which are weak soils. And that has led us to an understanding that we have a significant earthquake risk problem and shoreline stability problem along the waterfront. So this gives you a sense about what they constructed. After they built the seawall, they filled behind it with unengineered fill. The beautiful bulkhead buildings that line the Embarcadero are supported on wharves that are supported by piles driven through the seawall. And we have major trunk infrastructure serving the city in this zone. In a major earthquake, like a 1906 earthquake, we're concerned about the following result. These weak soils, including the Young Bay mud and unengineered fill, will liquefy. This is all on a slope, so things will push down the slope, pushing the seawall bayward. We've seen this is a lateral spreading kind of condition that can cause quite a bit of damage. We witnessed it in Haiti in the earthquake there. And you'll see that we have evidence of this lateral spreading along our own waterfront. This is near the Pier 27 cruise terminal after the 1906 earthquake. We've also got a problem with increasing flood risk over time. This is a photo of a king tide condition, which occurs several times a year. And you can see that while the wharfs were originally built at an elevation that served the city well, we're starting to lose some of the safety margin that we need. And so we're in a position where we're likely going to need to rebuild these wharves. How high? So we're looking at a range of sea level rise curves. The California Ocean Protection Council published its projections for sea level rise based on the latest science in 2018. The most likely sea level rise curve that they see, it would result in about 3.5 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Under a more extreme scenario, and this is really where we don't do much to stop greenhouse gas emissions, we could see up to 7 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. One of the policy conundrums that we're dealing with right now is that the Army Corps of Engineers has older sea level rise projections shown here on this graph. And we're trying to reconcile the state guidance and the federal guidance because we're accountable to both. Just thinking a little bit about the water column, we have daily high tides. Then we have something called 100-year flood events. These are very low probability events, large storm events that can produce storm surge and wave action at higher elevations. And with sea level rise, we'll see the elements of the water column increase over time until eventually high tide would overtop the shoreline. We're going to have earlier impacts. At about 2 feet of sea level rise, we'll start seeing groundwater rise as a result of the tidal influence because we have a permeable shoreline. And that could start to affect important infrastructure that we have in the Embarcadero. So we looked at these risks, everything that is publicly and privately owned in the future floodplain and in the earthquake risk zone, and calculated up to $30 billion in the damage and disruption from combined seismic and flood risk by the end of the century. And this is in a do nothing scenario. Obviously, we're standing up this program to address these risks. We saw very significant lateral spreading risk in the ferry building area and actually along the piers and wharves all the way up to Fisherman's Wharf. We're also seeing very significant seismic risk to the Embarcadero itself, the transit infrastructure and utility infrastructure in the Embarcadero. And we see a tipping point between 2 and 3 feet of sea level rise where we start to see significant flood damages into the downtown. And this multi-hazard risk assessment was really focused in the Embarcadero area to support Proposition A investment. We're also looking port-wide with the Army Corps of Engineers. This shows you the future floodplain, and we've got very significant employment activity in this area. These are very diverse neighborhoods, 58% people of color, significant city infrastructure, muni, and SFPUC infrastructure in this area. So all of this is going into probabilistic flood analysis, looking through the end of the century so that we can design a shoreline protection to reduce the risk. So now that's the risk. Now I want to turn to our planning effort and how we're working to buy down that risk. So we've been out in the public all through this process. It's been very important for us to understand the public's priorities so that as we enter this planning process, we're bringing those priorities into our thinking. They very much affirmed a focus on life safety and emergency response. They identified up and down the waterfronts the assets that they prized the most, and really encouraged us to think about not infrastructure or the shoreline, but how people use the waterfront, what they love about it, why they go there as we enter this planning effort. So this summarizes some of the things that they encouraged us to think about. Always have equity and sustainability at the center of our efforts with that focus on life safety and disaster response. But think about all these different systems up and down the waterfront and how we can make all of these systems as resilient as they can be. Through that public engagement, we developed this vision statement that the Waterfront Resilience Program will take actions to reduce seismic and climate change risks that support a safe, equitable, sustainable, and vibrant waterfront. So now I'm going to transition into the ADAPT plan. Again, this is a document intended to guide our efforts over 30 years. It will include the initial investments that we'll recommend under Proposition A, really focused on life safety and disaster response, more addressing the earthquake risk than the flood risk. With the Army Corps, we're going to develop a range of coastal flood protection alternatives that we'll also document in the ADAPT plan, as well as other actions to achieve the program vision and goals. So as we're thinking about 7.5 miles of this amazing waterfront, we really think that we need to focus at the neighborhood scale. There are unique risks. Some areas of the shoreline are lower in different areas. We certainly have different public and private investment in the different areas of the waterfront, different services being provided in different areas. So we really need to have a neighborhood scale approach, looking at both near-term risk reduction and long-term risk reduction. To build coastal flood protection, one of the key questions that we have to address is how high do we need to build that protection? If the current elevation of the waterfront is subject to flood risk, what elevation will provide us protection, hopefully adaptable protection through the end of the century? And this is essentially the methodology. We need to look at those sea level rise curves, choose a baseline curve, select the year through which major flood defenses will perform. We have to account for those rare coastal storm events because we don't want flooding coming from those rare events. We're incorporating FEMA guidance on flood protection. And when we add all of that up, we get to an elevation of probably 15 feet measured by the North American vertical datum. and we probably need to be adaptable to close to 19 feet. And now I'll translate that for you. So looking at the right-hand side of this slide, most of the shoreline today is between 8 and 12 feet, according to that North American vertical datum. So that means we need to gain between 3 and 7 feet of elevation along the shoreline. And just to give you a visual example, I don't know how many of you have been down to the new Waterfront Emergency Transportation Agency terminal, downtown terminal, right south of the ferry building. They've designed this to be resilient to sea level rise through the life of the infrastructure. And it's quite a big elevation change. So imagine that level of change along the waterfront, and you can begin to visualize the significance of the work that we're starting to undertake. So, and I just want to walk through the different zones of the waterfront. I think we all know how varied it is, but you know, we have a gorgeous waterfront. We want to maintain that connection to the bay, continue to provide a place where people want to recreate and enjoy bay views. But it is very distinct. We have unique conditions like Mission Creek that pose their own unique challenges. And the industrial southern waterfront that is so important for the port's maritime activities and in terms of providing jobs and an industrial base for the city in the southern waterfront. As we're thinking about the development of these adaptation strategies, we want to look to other great waterfronts for inspiration and what we can do here. We saw some of that. You'll see China Basin, San Francisco on the bottom portion of this slide. We've been working with our development partners for the Mission Rock new neighborhood that is planned on port property. And they've done some really exciting work to think about new parks along Mission Creek and how they might meet the creek. So the adaptation strategies that we'll develop, again, implementable over decades, will include initial projects, big moves, essentially coastal flood protection, some policy considerations, and of course, further planning efforts, because we do need to plan at that neighborhood scale. As part of developing the big moves, the coastal flood protection, we'll need to choose a line of defense where we're going to stop the water, and the adaptation zone over which we're going to gain elevation. We'll need seismic strategies to stabilize those weak soils, and adaptation pathways, which is essentially a plan for how we're going to implement these improvements over time. We're developing a range of adaptation strategies that we're then going to evaluate through these evaluation criteria. These are the categories that we'll use: feasibility and performance. What does it mean for our neighborhoods and waterfront users, society and equity? The cost of these improvements relative to the amount of damage that they'll reduce, and then environment. What can we do to improve the shoreline environment? Here's the schedule for the next couple of years. We're developing these program and project recommendations, gearing up to release a draft ADAPT plan in the early part of next year. And then everybody will have an opportunity to weigh in on very tangible recommendations for how we would address the shoreline. And then we would start work on Proposition A projects, smaller projects to improve life safety and disaster response, and start CEQA on those projects. All of this is going to be a multi-billion-dollar effort over time. We've got some secured sources like the bond. The Army Corps study could lead to very significant federal funding. We, of course, have our public-private partnerships, which are our primary mechanism at the port for attracting private investment in the waterfront to provide a range of public benefits. And we're going to need to seek new sources. We're very happy that the state of California's budget included $3.7 billion in resilience funding. So they're really recognizing the need to act now at the state level. Closing with a focus on Proposition A, we're through the planning phase. We've identified a range of projects to improve seismic performance along the waterfront and flood risk where we can. We're looking to get the Port Commission's endorsement of the first project so that we can begin design, environmental review, and move into construction of those projects by 2024. Which will provide some really important economic opportunities. And so we're looking at the types of projects that we're developing, understanding the training programs that are in process and the opportunities that we could point those entry-level trainees to, so that we're providing good work opportunities for San Francisco residents. And we're also thinking about how do we prepare local business enterprises to team up with prime contractors so that they can be successful in bidding on some of this work? I'll close, and we should share out these links. We have a very robust website that includes all of the information that we've developed over the last 3 years. Including story maps, which are a great way to zoom into an area of the waterfront that you might be interested in. So definitely encourage folks to visit our website. And then we're also hosting Ask Me Anything sessions with Port staff. There's actually one of these that is scheduled on August 19th from 4:30 to 5 p.m. We can circulate this link as well. And we just really want to be available to address the public's questions about the work that we're doing in the program. And so with that, I will stop presenting and unshare my screen.
All right. Thanks, Brad. That is a lot to cover in 30 minutes. I have a whole list of questions, and I see some in the chat here. I think it's important, and I think you tried to cover it. This work over a long period of time is going to affect all of San Francisco and not just port tenants. So I'm glad that we're here, and we'll continue to share this information with folks that are downtown, folks that are in the SOMA, that will eventually have impact and a vote potentially and a voice of how these are executed. Backing up a little bit, I'm intrigued when you begin to think about the infrastructure opportunities here, and you talk about jobs and local jobs. And I know that's way down the road yet, but just if you can talk a little bit about maybe other cities, maybe like Boston, other port cities, Miami, LA, Houston, and some that might be a little bit ahead of us, but the jobs that are created, and one of the challenges that the Chamber of Commerce is trying to help out with is the workforce pipeline. What kind of jobs do we want kids now that are graduating high school potentially in San Francisco? What kind of jobs are there going to be there for them in 2027? And what do they want to be studying now with our academia partners here in San Francisco? Is it engineering? Is it hydrology? Is it water testing? All of these things. But if you can, maybe talk a little bit about what we plan to do here locally, but maybe what other cities might be doing in advance of that as well.
It's a great question. And, we've actually got, as part of our large contract that is supporting this effort, we've got a team that's looking very specifically at workforce development and local business enterprise opportunities. So on the workforce development piece, they've been surveying existing workforce training programs that are available. We're too small as a program to set up our own training efforts, so we need to take advantage of existing training efforts, whether they're through City College or City Build, through OEWD. And we're really grateful that we've got other larger departments like the SFPUC who've been through this before and blazed a bit of a trail. So we're learning from their efforts. And we are also in the process right now of surveying other cities and how they've approached this. So our team has been in touch with Seattle. You know, they're spending billions now, and so they're further down the road. And so I'll have more to report on that, but we see that as vital to the success of the program. Eventually, there are going to be billions of dollars spent here, and we need to have local workers having opportunity to get those jobs. Some of the early things that we're doing in the program are internships. So right now we're in the planning and engineering phase of the work, and really trying to bring on either college students or recent college grads to intern in the program so that we build capacity for the resilience field generally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. You mentioned, I think, a term, trunk infrastructure. I think you said that, and I wasn't sure if that referred to underground power, maybe even BART tube along the waterfront. Is that what you refer to when you say trunk infrastructure?
Yes, so that the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, as an example, has transport storage boxes that are located underneath the Embarcadero. And it's very large infrastructure. You could drive large trucks through this infrastructure. And it really is the conveyance system to get combined sewer flows from downtown down to the Southeast Treatment Plant. There's another transport storage box that's connected to the North Point plant, which is a wet weather plant right along the Embarcadero. And then most of Muni's light rail vehicles enter that and exit that Embarcadero Muni tunnel to get down to storage at Muni Metro East. And so we're pretty confident that the transport storage boxes are going to perform just fine. It's more local utilities that may be damaged in the Embarcadero, but we are going to be meeting with the SFMTA to talk about the performance of the light rail and whether or not it could be damaged under some of these earthquake events and what that would mean for transit service post-earthquake. So there's some pretty big infrastructure systems that we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, love it. I'm always fascinated by what's underground in San Francisco. Maybe one day the chamber will do a whole webinar on what's underneath San Francisco, water mains, etc. What do you know, I realize there are two different, when you talk about risks, two different risks, the flood risk and earthquake risks, and they're almost equally as dangerous, but not really comparable, because tonight could be the earthquake and the flood will be over several years. But when it's here, it's almost too late to begin any work. How do you balance those two when responding to the Army Corps of Engineers study, and weigh those two, and which one becomes a higher priority, earthquake, seismic work, or flood work, or is it all combined and bundled together in the study?
So really good question. The real problem that we have today is earthquake risk. There's a 72% chance of a major earthquake on one of the Bay Area faults by 2050. So that's we'll be
here probably. Yeah.
It's gonna happen, right, at some point in that period, and so that is where we are going to focus our Proposition A investment, is trying to buy down some of that earthquake risk. I was describing earlier a shoreline stability problem, which is also an earthquake risk problem. Solving that issue really does require billions of dollars. And so thinking about the Army Corps study, we think that we need to address both coastal flood protection and shoreline stability with the same set of improvements. And we're working very closely with the Army Corps to try and convince them that that's just smart planning, multi-hazard planning. They tend to be focused on their water mission. And so we had to go to Congress and amend something called the Water Resources Development Act this last year. Speaker Pelosi carried an amendment for us that will help us with the Army Corps to address both of those risks. Okay.
And on this study, this is such an important factor for this project and all of San Francisco. How can the chamber, how can your average person, average resident, average business owner, not just in San Francisco, but maybe someone lives outside of San Francisco, but comes into the city for work, how can they support that study? How can they click the yes button? How can they write a letter of support? How can they attend some of the charrettes that maybe you are having to become more educated, but also just to put some backing behind a thumbs up on the study?
So we've had great participation to date. We've been doing outreach for the last 3 years. We had to move, like everybody did, online in this COVID period. We're moving towards being able to publish the draft adaptation strategies towards the end of this year. And we're going to be engaging publicly on those adaptation strategies. And so that's the first engagement. This is a public waterfront. It's a regional, a statewide, a national asset. And we really need people to engage in looking at those adaptation strategies. Are they going to deliver the kind of waterfront that we'll all be proud of over the next 50 years? So that's the most important engagement. And I think that's coming at the end of the year. For people who want to get involved now, I want to direct people to our website to learn more because we want people involved in this effort.
Yeah, great. I'll take one follow-up question related from the chat. And Cliff Waldeck asked, Brad, please share the port's vendor outreach program and how can small businesses potentially become involved in this larger effort? Obviously, there's big movements, but also there's opportunities for small businesses in San Francisco to participate.
So, hi, Cliff. Nice to see you here. Thanks for attending. What I will do is follow up with Kim. We have some vendor outreach efforts that are port-wide, and we love to have people come down and see what the contract opportunities are port-wide. And then we also have the Waterfront Resilience Program efforts, really focused on getting LBEs set up for when we're bidding work, which is not too far down the road. And so I'll follow up with Kim on some links to both of those opportunities.
Great. Thank you. And I'll just put one call out. If there's any other questions that want to end up, put in the chat, we'll entertain some more questions. But Brad, I've had the opportunity of working with you closely over 17 years, I guess, maybe more. I don't know. I lose track of that. But your commitment to the port 17 years ago and your curiosity for climate change and your curiosity for the greening of San Francisco is really kind of come to an opportunity for you to lead this. And as I heard you give your presentation, just proud that you are at the helm of this after studying it and knowing the port and its situations, but also having an environmental protection hat on as well for the city. So thanks very much for doing that. Anything you want to talk about just briefly about, people have different notions about where the port is and what it does. And the port at one time historically was this great commerce spot using maritime traffic. And over the period of time, Oakland, as we all know, has taken over some of the containerization of ships, the big cranes there, the big rail and lay down space. And the Port of San Francisco has pivoted before the word pivoted was popular this last year, but has become more of a real estate opportunity, whether it is entertainment, Fisherman's Wharf, a cruise ship terminal, the Exploratorium. And I know this is not exactly within the realm of the topic of this, but how do you see the growth of the port coming along? But then also that opportunity of where the port wants to go, should go, and building more attention towards the resiliency work that needs to happen. I do think they are sort of hand in hand, because you have to talk about what is coming down the road, and part of the resiliency work is preparing for just that.
So thank you for that. I will say right now, like I'm sure many of your members, the port is going through a bit of a tough time, and our tenants are going through a bit of a tough time. We've tourism dependent in some areas of the waterfront, and so we're having to do without that. We're waiting for the day when we can have cruise ships revisit the port. The port's reacted to that with some programs to support our tenants, rent relief efforts. We've tried to help the city's COVID response. Longer term, I did talk about those public-private partnerships earlier. We've got 2 neighborhoods that are planned, one of which is actually in construction now. Very happy to have a partnership with the Giants at Mission Rock and Brookfield at Pier 70. We've also pursued some RFPs for Port Finger piers. So we're looking at redevelopment of piers 38 and 40. How can we bring some investment and some life to that South Beach area of the waterfront? Also working at 3032. It's been a pier that's been a little bit difficult to develop, as Rodney knows about. But we've got a strong development partner in Strata who's thinking about commercial uses on the pier and residential uses on Seawall Lot 330. And I know that all of us are thinking about how we can develop more jobs and economic opportunity in the southern waterfront as well, where I think we're seeing some of our strongest maritime activity in the southern waterfront. So Tesla is exporting electric cars out of Pier 80. That we have the city's batch plants that really, supply construction activity in the city. That's all on port property. And we're thinking about new PDR opportunities in the southern waterfront. So the port's a dynamic organization and always looking for new investment, new opportunities to partner, and really hope that we see strong growth over the next 5 years as we come out of the pandemic.
Great, Brad. I'm almost assured of that. And if anybody has a free Saturday, whatever, take a bike ride along the entire port property and see the Mission Rock progression there, Pier 70, what's going on there. The Petroleum Power Plant, I think, is an exciting project. So hopefully people will become more familiar with what is going on and all the variety of work that the Port of San Francisco is doing. So Brad Benson, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And I think this is just the beginning. We will have more of these opportunities to share information. And the Chamber of Commerce is absolutely happy to try to steer more attention towards this project and other projects of the port. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Brad. Thank you. Want to close out by thanking Kilroy again and SOM for their sponsorship of BuildSF. Want to make sure that you are aware of 2 big events that are happening. October 7th will be our WELL conference, our Women's Empowerment and Leadership and Learning conference, and our 30th anniversary EBBYs on October 28th. So you can find out more about that on sfchamber.com. Please join those, so important. And as you know, every Wednesday, an e-newsletter comes out offering the latest information about pandemic, recovery, what's going on, some good news, bad news, tough news. That's something important to try to follow if you can sign up for those emails. So with that, again, thanks very much, Brad, and everyone have a nice day, and thank you for attending.